A loaded 9mm sat untouched in the glove box, and an uncashed paycheck waited on the dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition of the truck in the driveway, and the man who owned all of it had walked out of an ordinary house and simply vanished. 3 months later, a man paddling a canoe down the Charles River would find what was left of him. David Cox had already survived the Marine Corps, a court-martial that could have put him away for life, and a Hollywood film that turned the worst night of his career into entertainment. What he didn't survive was a quiet winter morning back home, and more than 30 years later, nobody can tell you who walked him into those woods. David was born in Boston in November 1966 and grew up in Needham, a comfortable suburb. He was the youngest of three, with an older brother, Stephen, and an older sister, Christine. His parents split when he was 15, and he bounced between them before finishing at Needham High School in 1985. He didn't waste time after graduation, and David signed up for the Marine Corps almost immediately, enlisting alongside a close friend through a buddy program that kept them together. They went to Parris Island, the recruit depot in South Carolina, where the Corps takes ordinary teenagers apart and rebuilds them into fighting men. David made it through boot camp, qualified as a scout sniper, and ended up serving in Panama, South Korea, and at Guantanamo Bay on Cuba. By the time he left the service in 1989, he'd reached the rank of corporal and earned an honorable discharge. But it was what happened at Guantanamo that would follow him for the rest of his short life. David's first overseas posting put him on the fence line at Gitmo, guarding the perimeter that separated the American base from Castro's Cuba. He was part of a security team, and by his own account he belonged to an unofficial inner circle the men called the 10. You earned your way in by doing brutal things, running in full gear through 110-degree heat, hanging off a 60-foot tower by your hands until your grip gave out. One Marine in the platoon didn't fit. Private First Class William Alvarado had been writing letters to a Texas congressman. He was complaining about conditions on the base and about Marines firing shots across the line into Cuba. He wanted off the base, and he'd gone around the chain of command to say so, and to the rest of the platoon, that was a betrayal of the highest order. According to the men involved, the order to deal with Alvarado was never written down or said outright. The way David's old squad leader later described it, their platoon commander had implied that if they were good Marines, something ought to happen. So one night in the late summer of 1986, around 1:30 in the morning, several of them went into Alvarado's room. They blindfolded him, gagged him with a pillowcase, bound him with tape, and dragged him from his bunk. The plan, as David told it, was humiliation rather than harm. Shave the man's head and leave it at that. David produced the clippers and got to work, but then everything went wrong, at least to the extent that anything had ever gone right in this situation. Within minutes, Alvarado stopped struggling. He was choking, his lungs filling with fluid, and he was turning a frightening shade of purple. The men cut the assault short and called for help, and Alvarado was rushed to the infirmary, then flown to a hospital in Miami, where he made a full recovery. The Marines who'd held him down were arrested almost at once. What followed was the legal mess that made the case famous. All 10 Marines were handed a choice. They could take a plea deal that carried no criminal conviction, but came with a dishonorable discharge, or they could roll the dice at a court-martial on charges of attempted murder. 7 of them took the deal, but David and 2 others refused, saying that it was, in essence, a hazing gone very wrong. Their defense was that they'd been following an order, even an unspoken one, and that nobody had ever intended for anyone to be seriously injured or worse. It was a hard argument to win, especially with a colonel denying he'd given any such order. David's appointed attorney warned him plainly that, Obedience to orders was a defense that had failed at Nuremberg and failed again for the officer behind my lie. David fought it anyway because he believed he'd done nothing wrong, and in the end, the 4-day court-martial cleared him of the serious charges. He was convicted only of simple assault, and since he'd already spent more time than he was ordered to serve in the brig awaiting trial, the sentence amounted to nothing. He went back to finish his enlistment and left the Marines with an honorable discharge, something he never could have managed if he took the deal. For David, this was virtually a complete vindication of his version of events, especially since he had never denied the assault itself, but the intent to end the life of Alvarado. Here's where the story takes its strange turn, and it's probably the reason why you've heard of the case. One of the young Navy lawyers who'd worked the case happened to be the sister of a struggling playwright named Aaron Sorkin, and she told her brother about it. Sorkin turned it into a Broadway play, and in December 1992, that play became a blockbuster film starring Tom Cruise, Jack Nicholson, and Demi Moore. The movie kept the bones of David's real ordeal and changed the details that mattered most. On screen, the hazed Marine died, and the defendants were convicted and drummed out of the Marines. Millions of people watched it, saw that it was based on a real account, and assumed they understood what those men had done, but it wasn't true. David was furious. He felt the film had branded him a hardened criminal and made strangers rich off his name without ever asking. He went on the radio to set the record straight, talking openly about the case and what he'd seen the American military doing in Cuba. Along with several other Marines, he was part of a lawsuit against the studio, seeking $10 million and arguing the story had been lifted from their lives. The suit went nowhere, but by then David had made himself a loud public man with an extreme grievance. Ultimately, though, he accepted that he didn't really have the power to change the Hollywood narrative, either in the court of public opinion or a court of law. By the start of 1994, David was 27 and trying to build a normal life, and he was living with his girlfriend, Elaine Tinsley, in Natick, Massachusetts. He'd earned a 2-year paralegal degree and worked a string of ordinary jobs. At that moment specifically, he was doing temporary work for United Parcel Service, better known as UPS, and hoping it would turn into something permanent. On the night of January 4th, his back was bothering him, so he slept on the couch. The next morning, Tinsley woke him before she left for work around 8:30. He was waiting on a call that would tell him whether he'd gotten the full-time job with UPS. He specifically didn't have any plans to leave the house because he wanted to be around for the call, which he anticipated would be coming that morning. That call came, and when Tinsley phoned home at noon and checked the answering machine, there was a message from David's boss at UPS offering him the position. Now, maybe I'm showing my age here, but I had to confirm that you could call an answering machine to check messages. And yes, this was apparently a routine occurrence. The good news he'd been waiting for had arrived, but David didn't pick up when she called him to tell him that he had missed the call. This was extremely odd because he was supposed to be glued to the phone the whole morning waiting for that specific call. She tried again at 1 o'clock, but there was still nothing. Absolute radio silence. When she got home around 5:30, the house was oddly quiet and every interior door stood open. The rabbit they normally kept in a cage in the kitchen was loose and hopping through the rooms. A few glasses had been knocked over and David's truck was right where it should be, out in the driveway, but David wasn't anywhere. Then she looked closer at the truck. The keys were in the ignition, and his uncashed paycheck lay on the dashboard. His 9mm was tucked in the glove compartment, right where he'd have reached for it, and he was known to carry it routinely when he went out. A man who'd been trained to fight had left his weapon behind and gone off with someone, with no sign of a struggle to explain it. Tinsley called everyone she could think of, but no one had heard from him. For the time being, she didn't assume the worst, but as the night went on, Her panic ended up reaching a fever pitch. The next day, she filed a missing person report with the Natick police, but the initial searches turned up nothing. The family pleaded through the local media, and for 3 months, there were no leads at all, and the case went cold. On April 2nd, as the spring thaw finally pulled the snow off the ground, a man canoeing down the Charles River near Medfield noticed a shoe poking out from a tangle of branches. When he got closer, he found the remains of David in a wooded patch well off any road. The medical examiner's findings were grim and precise. David had been eliminated execution style, with multiple shots fired. 3 9mm shell casings were recovered at the scene, though the autopsy showed that 4 had been fired. And I find it unusual that only 3 casings were recovered, perhaps suggesting that there was a botched attempt by the assailant to recover them all. That said, I'm no weapons expert, so if you are, feel free to suggest any alternative explanation in the comments. The location also said something too, since the spot sat between 2 hunting ranges, the kind of place where a shot wouldn't make a single neighbor look up. Whoever brought David there knew the ground, and knew the area well enough to commit the crime there. And then there was what he was wearing. Cox had on his military-issue camouflage field jacket and his Marine Corps Scout Sniper hoodie, paired with jeans and white sneakers. His family and the investigators agreed on one odd point. David didn't wear any military-related clothes out in public, and he never had. Robbery was ruled out fast, since cash and credit cards were still in his wallet. Investigators came to believe David had left home willingly with someone he trusted, since there was no forced entry and no sign of a struggle. The walk to the spot where he was found ran the better part of a mile into the trees. Detectives reasoned that a stranger holding a weapon on him would have finished things within the first 40 yards, not marched him deep into the woods. David was, after all, a qualified scout sniper, an elite Marine, and the idea that the attacker would have taken this risk didn't seem right. David, they thought, had walked in beside someone he knew and trusted to a great degree, and that he was, in all likelihood, ambushed. His family split on what that meant, with many members of his immediate family going public with their personal theories. His brother Stephen recalled that David had mentioned spotting a UPS supervisor and a driver in what he believed was theft, months before he vanished. His mother had warned him he was being too loud on the UPS radio about the military, speaking too freely about things he'd been involved in. His sister, Christine, felt that the cold precision of it pointed to a professional job, but she was completely at a loss for who could be responsible. Then there was something that hinted at personal problems in David's life, and it turned out he had developed a gambling habit and owed money at the time of his death. Investigators looked hard at it and didn't buy it, and while they originally thought he may be deeply in debt, that wasn't the case. The debt came to only about $1,000, small enough that he had the funds in the bank to clear it if anyone had leaned on him. The case went cold the moment it began, and no suspect was ever named, nor was any motive ever pinned down. Everyone involved in his life, from his fellow soldiers at Guantanamo, to bookies, to the people at UPS, were investigated, but nothing was ever found. Some Hollywood figures involved in the lawsuit over the movie were also investigated, but they were cleared of all suspicion. In February 2019, 2 members of the Massachusetts State Police announced they were reopening the file. Both were former Marines themselves, and both believed that forensic techniques unavailable in 1994 might finally pull something usable from the evidence. As of now, that's where David's case stands, with no further breakthroughs or any additional developments. Anyway, I'm sure you're all expecting me to have some sort of theory on what actually happened here, but this one doesn't make sense to me at all. My gut feeling is that none of the speculative theories are right, but of course, a gut feeling is just that. One thing I'd like to know, but I can't find an answer to, is if David would wear military related stuff when he was hanging out around buddies from his time in the Marines. If he did, that could possibly point to someone from that period in his life. Perhaps someone who had a bone to pick with David over something that happened over his service. And I'm not even saying that would be something related to the hazing incident. I'm saying any sort of interpersonal conflict over the course of the years. That said, David may have put on his military clothing as a sign to his family and investigators that something was wrong. It may have been his coded way of instantly warning the people who cared about him that he was leaving his house under duress. I can also say for certain I don't believe for a second it was anyone involved in the movie or the lawsuit related to the movie. A Few Good Men was produced by a massive production company and had an astronomical inflation-adjusted budget of about $100 million. These sort of companies get routinely sued, and everyone involved understands that litigation is just one of the costs of doing business. The idea that there was any animus from someone on the winning side of the lawsuit on one of the most financially successful films of the decade strikes me as pure fiction. Anyway, all that said, I have a lot to say about theories I can rule out, but not much in the way of a coherent explanation of the evidence. On a June morning in 2011, a man stood in his own backyard in rural North Carolina with his barbecue tools laid out on the grill. His air conditioner was humming, and his 2 cars and his 2 motorcycles were parked exactly where they always sat. By that afternoon, his house was burning and he was gone, leaving behind no body and no goodbye to anyone who loved him. The only thing that remained was a dog that wandered home alone the next day, and a girlfriend who told his family not to worry, because Daniel had simply gone on vacation. The closest anyone has come to finding him is a single leg, poking out of a car trunk, wearing a sock that looked an awful lot like his, but more on that bizarre sighting in a moment. Daniel Moses was born on the 5th of July, 1951, and as an adult, you couldn't miss him, since he stood 6'3" and weighed in at over 2 bells. By 2011, he was 59, retired after a long career driving trucks, and back home on his family's land in Northampton County after spending most of his adult life up in New Jersey. In his retirement, he liked to fish and hunt, and more than anything, he loved to cook. That last part is what made him a local fixture, and somewhere along the way, Daniel started grilling chicken and bottling barbecue sauce, and it turned out he was very good at it. He built up a steady roster of customers scattered across the county, delivering plates by hand to neighbors who came to know him simply as Dan the Barbecue Man. It was part-time work, but it was the kind he genuinely enjoyed after a career with long hours on the road. He kept in regular touch with his family by phone, and slipping away without a word to anyone would have been completely out of character for him. The last confirmed sighting of Daniel came on the morning of June 16, 2011. He was seen standing behind his home on the 1900 block of W.J. Duke Service Road, out in the Rehoboth community near Rich Square. Later that same day, the small wooden house he lived in caught fire. One of his brothers got the call and rushed over, telling their sister Sheila the home was burning, but that Daniel wasn't inside it. When the fire was finally out, investigators picked through what was left and found something that didn't add up. There was no sign of Dan. Both of his cars and both of his motorcycles sat untouched, and the day after the fire, his dog trotted back to the property alone, with no owner anywhere in sight. Investigators would eventually rule the blaze an accident, blaming faulty wiring in the old building, but Daniel's family has never bought that explanation. For years, the case went cold, with no trace of Daniel. But then in 2022, a witness came forward and told investigators that, around the time Daniel disappeared, she had glimpsed a leg sticking out from the trunk of a car near his house. The foot, she said, was wearing a tennis shoe and the same kind of tube sock Daniel liked to pull on whenever he rode his motorcycle. By her account, a car ahead of her hit a bump near a bridge, and the trunk jolted open just long enough for her to register what was inside before it closed again. Now, I have to question why someone would wait a full 11 years to come forward with that information. I've personally never seen a human leg sticking out of the trunk of a car, but if I did, I would be on the phone with the cops immediately. This witness, on the other hand, decided that despite a man being missing from the neighborhood, she'd simply sit on it for 11 years. In April of 2023, that lead turned into boots on the ground, and dozens of searchers, along with sniffer dogs and drones, converged on the grounds of a former prison near the town of Jackson. Somewhere between 60 and 70 people, drawn from local agencies, North Carolina and Virginia teams, and the surrounding community, turned out to help. They combed roughly 140 acres of trees and fields, ground they believed might be hiding a grave. A detective who was working the case said that the search wasn't just a shot in the dark, but didn't reveal anything more of what happened. Anyway, the fact that the cops searched a very specific spot near those former prison grounds clearly suggests to me that they know much more than has been publicly reported. I also have some serious questions about the witness who waited 11 years to report seeing a leg sticking out of a trunk. I don't imagine there's any situation where someone just sits on that for so long, so I'm guessing there's more to that witness report that hasn't been disclosed. At any rate, I hope there's some justice for Dan in the coming years, and his family can have closure on this unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy dropping a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. Somewhere under a mesa in the far northwest corner of New Mexico, 16 tons of gold may still be lying in the dark, exactly where it was left in the summer of 1933. The man who put it there took care of one thing before he passed, and he never drew a map. When he carried the location into the grave, he turned a fortune into a riddle people have chased for nearly a century. The story begins, as a lot of doomed schemes do, with a few wealthy men in a room convincing each other they'd found a sure thing. In the early days of 1933, in the city of Cuernavaca, 5 wealthy Mexicans sat down to talk about gold. There was Leon Trabuco, a rancher and large-scale miner from Chihuahua, who was rich and hungry for much more. With him were Ricardo Arteaga, a rancher from Torreon, and Carlos Sepulveda, another rancher out of Chihuahua. There was also Rafael Borrega, an international banker with ties to Mexico and Spain, and Guzman Morata, an economics professor at the University of Mexico. Morata was effectively the brains behind the operation, and his pitch was simple and on paper, brilliant. The United States was 4 years deep into the Great Depression. The dollar was wobbling, and he was convinced Washington was about to push up the price of gold. At that point, gold sat at $20.67 an ounce. Morata figured the jump could be $10 an ounce or more, the kind of money that changes a man's life when he's holding tons of the stuff. Buy enough cheap in Mexico, hold it until the American price climbed, and the profit would be staggering. So they pooled their money and started buying as much gold as possible from small-scale miners all across the country. Buying the gold was the easy part, but getting it into the United States without going to prison was where things got interesting. The men took their hoard to a makeshift foundry, melted down coins and jewelry, and recast the whole lot into plain ingots that wouldn't draw as much attention. In under 3 months, they'd accumulated close to 16 tons of solid gold. Smuggling that much metal across the border was a felony that could put all of them behind bars for years, and they knew it. Their solution came from the air. Trabuco is said to have hired a pilot, a man remembered as Red Moiser. It's unclear from the narrative if that name was just an alias given by an American pilot to the wealthy Mexicans, and some researchers believe he was actually called Bill Elliott. Either way, the pilot loaded roughly 1 ton of gold at a time into a small plane and made the run after dark. He reportedly flew 16 evening runs over the following months, changing his route each time so the plane was never once caught crossing the border. The traditional narrative points to a final delivery landing on July 14th, 1933, which will be important, so keep that date roughly in mind. The pilot notably was never told what he was really doing, in the sense that he was never let in on the scheme. He knew he was delivering gold, and he knew it was a smuggling job, but he wasn't wired into the actual operation beyond that. He'd set the plane down on a remote plateau, unload his cargo as fast as possible, and was ordered to take off again immediately. From there, trucks carried the ingots off to a burial site that only Trabuco and whoever was responsible for hauling them off knew. He'd chosen a thinly populated stretch of desert near Farmington in the Four Corners country, close to the Ute and Navajo reservations. It was the kind of empty, sun-scorched ground where a man could bury a fortune and trust that the land would keep it a mystery. Here's where the whole beautiful plan started to come apart, and if you're a fan of American history during this period, you knew what was coming. The men were betting everything on the American government raising the price of gold, but when the government did exactly that, the monkey's paw curled. They just made it impossible for anyone like Trabuco to cash in and profit off their gold hoarding. In April of 1933, while the gold was still being flown north, President Franklin Roosevelt had already signed Executive Order 6102. This made it illegal for private citizens to hoard most gold, with a grace period to surrender what they held to the Federal Reserve for paper money. Then, on January 30th, 1934, came the Gold Reserve Act, and the price of bullion shot upward, and on paper, the group's profit ballooned by something like $7 million. But they couldn't legally sell a single ounce of it inside the country. And worse, they got greedy. Rather than offload the gold for whatever they could get, they decided to sit on it and wait for the price to climb higher. It was the decision that doomed them. 16 tons of treasure had effectively turned into 16 tons of trash they couldn't touch. Perhaps worse than trash, actually, because in general you don't end up getting clapped in cuffs by the feds for having something like that. If you wanted to write the men out of the story one by one, fate seemed determined to do it for you. Over the next several years, every one of Trabuco's partners passed away, under circumstances that are often made out to be mysterious. Personally, I don't see anything too unusual about what happened, but some believe that Trabuco had a hand in knocking off at least some of his associates. Borrega and Murata died from what are generally believed to be natural causes, while Sepulveda lost his life in a car crash. Arteaga went out in a way that's truly bizarre. He was gored in public by a fighting bull. The pilot's end was just as cinematic, and he allegedly perished in a bombing raid over Germany sometime in 1944 or 1945. That left Leon Trabuco. He was now the only living soul who knew where 16 tons of gold lay buried in the New Mexico desert, sitting on a fortune he had no legal way to spend. Now, I will note here that this may be something of a plot hole in the narrative, and there will be more on that shortly. Trabuco had also hired men with trucks to physically haul the gold and bury it, even if those men were kept in the dark about what they were actually moving. The idea that they didn't know it was valuable strikes me as implausible. I've never been in this situation, but if I was meeting someone at a clandestine airstrip near the border and burying something, I would probably assume what I was hauling had some value. For roughly 18 years, Trabuco tried to turn his buried gold back into money, and for roughly 18 years he failed. He worked the black market, reaching out to buyers who wouldn't ask awkward questions about the origins of the gold or why it had been smuggled into the United States. He dealt with men who were reportedly connected to the regimes in Germany and Italy, people who needed large amounts of gold to fund operations in North America. The strangest offer came in 1941 when a man calling himself Ivan Nasiceku approached Trabuco claiming to represent one of the royal houses of Europe. The buyer behind him was suspected to be Karl II, the deposed king of Romania, who was then living in exile in Mexico. The former king had been refused entry into the United States, and the theory goes that he hoped to buy his way across the border with a mountain of gold. Trabuco turned Ivan down flat, judging the whole thing too dangerous, and questioning whether he truly represented any European royalty at all. By 1952, the authorities had caught the scent, and Trabuco, by some accounts, had approached the government himself that year, hoping to quietly cut a deal. Instead of a handshake, he got a grand jury, convened to examine whether he and his partners had plotted to buy up Mexico's gold and dump it in the States for profit. In the end, he was never indicted, and then he slipped out of history altogether. Some accounts have him on his deathbed afterward. Others have him resurfacing in Spain years later, still working the phones, an old man chasing the same gold. Either way, true to form, he left no map behind to indicate where the 16 tons of gold had been left. The one breadcrumb he's said to have dropped near the end was a maddening remark that the gold lay only a few miles from a major New Mexico landmark, which in a state full of mesas and peaks and rivers, narrows it down to almost nothing. But of course, for treasure hunters, any crumb is potentially worth chasing. The legend might have died with Trabuco if not for the treasure hunters, and one in particular gave it most of his life. A man named Ed Foster spent more than 35 years combing the desert around Farmington. He became convinced he'd found the very airstrip Trabuco's pilot used back in 1933, on a plateau called Conger Mesa in San Juan County. Foster reportedly tracked down elderly women on the reservation who remembered a plane landing and taking off there. Of course, the problem with that is that memories fade, and just because planes took off and landed there doesn't mean they were the gold planes. He found other things too that appeared to confirm his suspicions that he was on the right trail. About 20 miles west of the mesa stood an old house that looked like nothing else on the reservation. It was a Mexican-style structure with a front door, a back door, and a veranda, which Foster suspected had been built as a guard post. Not far from it was a rock carved with a date and a phrase that, if real, is hard to argue with. 1933, 16 ton. Foster came to believe the gold lay somewhere inside the triangle marked by those 3 points, in the country near Shiprock Peak. When private ownership of bullion finally became legal again, at the end of 1974, the buried hoard, if it ever existed, was suddenly worth chasing all over again. The desert near Farmington has been walked, surveyed, and dug at by hopefuls for decades, all working from the same thin hand-me-down story and a handful of clues. As of yet, though, no one has found Leon Trabuco's 16 tons of gold, and perhaps they never will, because there's one more element to the lost treasure. The strongest argument against the Trabuco treasure isn't that the story is impossible, it's that it behaves like folklore. Skeptics point out that the legend seems to rest on a very narrow paper trail, and the entire narrative has a very dramatic flair. From Trabuco potentially eliminating other members of the cabal, to Roosevelt banning private gold hoarding as the last shipments were hitting America, it seems a little too perfect. Some skeptics have even gone so far as to say that the entire initial narrative of the smuggling was invented, and that subsequent investigations were based on rumor. Personally, I think it's very possible that elements of the narrative are exaggerated or have grown in the telling, but I don't think that means the whole thing is fake. Treasure stories almost always get polished over time, and it doesn't take much to add in a little extra mystery by claiming Trabucco may have been involved in the deaths of his associates. Though the evidence is quite thin, there's absolutely nothing to suggest that Trabucco was involved in the deaths of his partners in crime. It's something that can simply be inserted into the history by someone who cares more about telling a compelling narrative about a treasure, because the underlying evidence is so thin. Also, timelines get cleaned up over time to make the narrative more dramatic, but again, that doesn't mean the original events didn't happen. Specifically, the idea that the executive order was being signed right during the final gold flights seems like it was possibly added in to add more tension to the narrative. In the end, this is a narrative about rich men getting together to commit what would have been a fairly low-stakes, high-reward financial crime if Roosevelt hadn't changed the laws. To me, that sounds like the exact sort of thing that has happened countless times throughout history. Trabucco's Lost Gold is the classic financial crime narrative about a group of rich men who would risk it all to be just a little more rich.